My status outranks yours!
Sure! You should check hers.
You've got 24 hours to take it down, or the board will file removal with county enforcement. That's how Geraldine Vossler opened our morning, chin tilted, clipboard in hand, standing dead center on my front steps like she owned the land beneath her orthopedic wedges. Geraldine, president of the Clear Hollow Ridge HOA board, had never stepped foot on my porch until today. Now, she was jabbing her pen at my daughter's kinetic sculpture, the one spinning quietly in the wind like it didn't just get marked for extinction. That fixture, she sneered, violates Article 11C, non-conforming lawn ornaments. I didn't say anything at first. I just reached beside the swing, pulled the protective cover off the base panel, and tapped the thin brass plate screwed into the sculpture's frame. It read, Therapeutic Mobility Access Grant, Federally Registered ADA Design, Code 7112B9. Her eyes flickered just for a second. If you've ever had an HOA weaponize code against you without even knowing what law you live under, you need to subscribe now, because the only thing HOA bullies like this fear more than exposure is someone who's fluent in their own language. I looked Geraldine in the eye and said evenly, This design's already approved by a federal accessibility grant. You can't override that with a clipboard. I'm Cassian Morell, FAA Certified Zoning Compliance Officer. I inspect heliports, air corridors, and rooftop installations for a living. But here in Clear Hollow Ridge, I'm just the guy with the daughter who built a sculpture too honest for the neighborhood to handle. That sculpture is more than aluminum and wind balance. My daughter Tallis forged every curved blade herself after my wife passed. Her therapy, her expression, her way of rebuilding silence into motion. That shape isn't abstract. It's her voice. She doesn't speak much, but she builds what she feels. And Geraldine? She wants it gone because it doesn't match the neutral stonework aesthetics of the houses she lords over from her HOA throne. Houses with uplights, fire pits, and rooftop gardens that were never approved either. But those belong to her friends. Tallis's sculpture? It's too different, too original, too public. Geraldine didn't even flinch as she folded the violation notice and pressed it into my palm like she was handing over a warning label. You'll be fined daily until it's removed. Failure to comply will result in exterior enforcement. I've already informed the insurer. She turned to leave, didn't wait for a reply, but I watched the paper flutter in my hand, her official seal stamped at the bottom just above a forged architectural committee signature. What she didn't know yet, the light grid under that sculpture intersects with a zoning buffer that, by FAA boundary rules, prohibits uplight structures within 150 feet due to nearby air traffic. She just filed a complaint, in writing, against the one object on this block that's not breaking the law. The rest of her landscape? Well, that's about to face a spotlight far brighter than her patio sconces. So here's the thing. I didn't move here for a fight. I moved here for quiet, for routine, for a second chance at fatherhood after grief tried to burn it all down. But when someone targets your kid's recovery project and lies to do it, you don't back off. You don't negotiate. You document. You prepare. You aim higher. This isn't about property codes anymore. It's about the difference between power and authority. Geraldine thinks she has both. She only ever had one. And I'm about to take that from her, inch by inch, on the very soil she pretends to guard. Because what she really violated wasn't Article 11C. It was my daughter's right to exist without apology. And that's one regulation I know how to enforce. Where are you watching from? This one's personal. Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever faced HOA abuse, we're just getting started. By the time the second violation notice showed up, it wasn't even a piece of paper. It was a digital citation posted publicly in the Clear Hollow Ridge HOA community app, complete with a photo of our sculpture, a timestamp, and a bold red banner that read, Non-Compliance Escalated. They didn't even blur Tallis's name. I stood there, staring at it on my phone while the morning sun cut across the sky like a blade. 2 joggers passed me near the mail kiosk. They didn't make eye contact. Geraldine had turned us into an example. The HOA had always operated like that. Quiet punishments, subtle pressure, public shaming disguised as transparency. A compost bin here, an unauthorized gate color there. Every resident had a story, whispered in driveways and exchanged like contraband. But no one ever stood up. Not because they agreed, but because fighting took energy most didn't have. And Geraldine knew it. She ran the HOA like it was a private club. If you attended the monthly brunches and donated to the beautification committee, you got your exception. If you skipped a meeting or questioned a policy, your fence got remeasured, or your landscaping got flagged. Talus's sculpture gave her the perfect opportunity to flex. That afternoon, I walked the neighborhood, not to argue, just to observe. The same neutral aesthetic Geraldine had cited as the standard, it didn't exist. 3 homes had colored string lights. One had a copper flamingo tucked beside a fire hydrant. 2 homes had visible propane tanks, not screened by anything. None had violations listed. I passed one house with a full-sized replica of a ship's wheel mounted to the garage exterior. It was charming, it was different, and it was untouched. Every non-conforming element in Clear Hollow Ridge had one thing in common. It only mattered when it wasn't hers. I circled back toward the northern edge of the neighborhood, where the homes overlook the ridge trail and face west. That's where Geraldine's property sits. Stone-heavy facade, spotless hedges, and 2 newly installed uplight poles flanking her walkway like runway beacons. They weren't in the original design filings I'd reviewed when I first moved in. And there, beside her backyard deck, tucked into the corner where her lot meets the preserved bluff line, scaffolding, 3 stories high, with reinforced framing. Something was being built. I walked slower. That wasn't just a gazebo. That was vertical clearance, open deck elevation, and something that looked a hell of a lot like a mounted lighting grid pointed skyward. I'd seen those specs before, on rooftops, commercial helipad assessments, emergency response builds near medical corridors. She wasn't renovating. She was planning a landing site. Suddenly, her obsession with sight lines, her rigid control over front-facing aesthetics, the nonstop scrutiny of minor design variations, it all made sense. She needed the HOA clean, uniform, predictable. Anything disruptive risked triggering the attention of the zoning board, or worse, the FAA. And Talus's sculpture? It was registered in a national accessibility database tied to open-air design. Anything with movement, reflection, or kinetic components within 250 feet would ping a lighting and obstruction analysis review. That sculpture wasn't just a target, it was a threat to her secret build. I headed home, heart hammering. Inside, Talus was in the living room, working silently on her latest build model, tiny interlocking wings made from recycled aluminum. She didn't look up when I entered. Her hands were steady, but I could see the strain behind them. The HOA app's notice hadn't just gone public. It had gone viral, at least within the neighborhood. Talus's sculpture, the one she made to process grief, was being dissected by people who'd never asked what it meant. I sat across from her, careful not to speak too soon. But I already knew what came next. This wasn't just about standing up to Geraldine. It wasn't even just about protecting my daughter's design. This was about exposing a system that was designed to silence, to erase, to elevate a false standard of beauty while quietly breaking every rule it enforced. And I had the training to pull the thread without snapping it. Geraldine thought she'd weaponized the HOA against us. What she didn't realize? She'd built her ambitions on airspace. And I inspect those for a living. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be routine, one of those second Tuesday of the month affairs with coffee urns, pre-approved minutes, and the illusion of democracy. But I wasn't there for the snacks or the seating charts. I was there for Orban Thale. The room was set up in the community clubhouse, a vaulted ceiling lodge that tried too hard to mimic rustic charm, exposed beams, stone fireplace, faux wood chairs lined in rows. A podium at the front with the Clear Hollow Ridge seal mounted proudly behind it, as if this place governed more than garden edges and mailbox widths. Geraldine stood up front in her usual steel-gray blazer, reading the agenda aloud like it was gospel. She didn't look at me when I entered. She didn't need to. The smirk pulling at the corner of her mouth said enough. Orban sat to her right, head lowered, glasses slipping down his nose, thumbing through a manila folder like he was searching for something he'd already memorized. When his eyes lifted, they met mine for half a second, then dropped again. I took a seat near the back and listened. Fence height variance, budget reallocation for perimeter landscaping, a brief motion to approve the removal of non-conforming decorative installations from common view zones. That was the line. That was the one aimed directly at me. It passed, of course, no questions. Geraldine called for a vote, and the board raised their hands like marionettes, except Orban. He hesitated, just long enough to matter. His hand hovered, then rose, slowly. Not commitment, compliance. He never looked up again after that. After the meeting adjourned, the crowd thinned out quickly. A few residents lingered for soft complaints or whispered praise. I waited until the room cleared enough to make my move. He was packing up his folder when I approached. No introductions. No small talk. "I know about the lights," I said quietly. "And I know what's being built behind Geraldine's lot." He froze. Just 1 second, enough for me to see the flicker. "You used to work FAA records, right?" I continued. "Before retirement." He nodded, slowly. Still didn't meet my gaze. "I filed flight corridor overlays for 10 years. That deck violates elevation codes," I said. "Not just for residential lots. For the entire lighting grid, I checked the permit index. There's nothing." Silence stretched. I stepped closer, lowered my voice. "She's covering something, and she's using the board to scrub the sight lines." Orban finally looked up. Behind the thick lenses, his eyes were red-rimmed. Tired. Like he hadn't slept right in months. "I didn't sign that variance," he murmured. "Not the way it's recorded." He swallowed hard. "She rewrote the minutes, backdated the approval, said it was a unanimous vote. It wasn't." There it was, the crack. The first fracture in Geraldine's carefully constructed wall of control. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. He looked away again, lips tightening. "Because last time someone challenged her," he said slowly. "They lost their roof permit mid-renovation. Code inspector showed up 2 weeks later. Fines stacked. They moved out within 3 months. He shook his head. "I'm not young anymore. I just want to finish my term in peace." I nodded. I understood. Fear was a currency in Clear Hollow Ridge. Geraldine had a ledger, and everyone owed her something. But Orban had just become something far more valuable than an accomplice. He was a witness. And if I played this right, he wouldn't have to speak publicly to be useful. As I turned to leave, he spoke one more time. "Just be careful. She doesn't come at people directly. She isolates them, turns the board, then the neighborhood." I paused at the door. "She tried that already," I said. "But I'm not trying to belong here. I'm trying to protect my daughter." He didn't reply. But his folder didn't close. Not right away. I saw his fingers tap once against the paper inside. Then again, like they were drumming against a decision not yet made. Outside, the night was still. No wind. But I knew it was coming. And now I had a name. A voice. One Geraldine hadn't accounted for. The fine started the next morning. $100 for non-compliant visual obstruction, then $150 for failure to remove flagged structure. By the end of the week, the total was approaching 1,000, each notice emailed and mailed, always with the same clipped signature. G. Vossler, President, Clear Hollow Ridge HOA. Tallis stopped checking the mailbox. She didn't say anything, but I saw the way her shoulders hunched when the envelopes hit the kitchen table. Every notice felt like a personal attack, because it was. Then came the drone. A low whirring sound outside our window, right around 7:15 a.m., just as I was pouring her cereal. I stepped out onto the porch, and there it was, hovering 20 feet up, rotating in slow motion, its lens tilted down at the sculpture, watching. I didn't wave. I didn't yell. I grabbed my phone, opened the Clear Hollow Ridge app, and sure enough, a new feature had been added. Anonymous compliance footage submissions encouraged. The HOA had begun crowdsourcing surveillance. A day later, the sculpture's image appeared again, this time in a post titled, "Maintaining the Integrity of Our Community Aesthetic." It featured side-by-side images of homes with appropriate harmony and ours, cropped to make the sculpture look jagged and out of place. They blurred the house number, not our names. One comment read, "If it doesn't follow the rules, it doesn't belong here. Simple." Another, "Sad that people think they're above the process. It's not personal, it's standards." Except that it was personal. It had always been. Tallis barely left her room that day. I heard her undoing bolts on the sculpture model in her closet, the quiet click of pieces being taken apart. I didn't interrupt. Not yet. Let her hands work through the noise. That afternoon I received an alert that our home had been placed in escalated enforcement review. That phrase didn't exist in the HOA bylaws. Geraldine was making it up as she went, and no one was stopping her. She was building a case, a paper trail. If she could show continued non-compliance, she could trigger a lien vote. Once a property hit lien status, the HOA had leverage over title transfers, refinancing, and even access to common areas. That wasn't just harassment, that was economic strangulation. And the irony? The very thing she was using to suffocate us was the same tool I used to dismantle helipad violations across the state: pattern escalation, improperly filed amendments, and procedural overreach. I knew her type: authoritarian, but subtle. She didn't bark, she documented. She wrapped intimidation in process and smiled through every fraudulent vote. So I started documenting too. I photographed her deck every morning, measuring shadow lines, checking light pole angles, monitoring her uplights after dark. I opened a folder on my desktop and labeled it Clear Hollow Ridge, Unpermitted Structures. Within days, it had a dozen entries, none of them mine. I mapped her drone's flight pattern based on audio capture logs from my security cam. FAA regulation prohibits recreational drones from flying over private property without consent. She wasn't just watching. She was violating federal airspace without knowing it. That night, I took Talus for a walk down by the trailhead. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the ridge. She hadn't spoken in hours. "You know," I said, "your sculpture has a footprint of less than 6 feet. That's smaller than the average topiary, but it moves, and that makes it visible." She nodded, eyes fixed ahead. "It's supposed to be seen," she said softly. "It's the first thing I made that didn't hide." I stopped walking. So did she. "That's why she hates it," I said, "because it tells the truth." Talus looked at me then, not afraid, not broken, just quiet. But behind that quiet, I saw the same thing I'd seen years ago when her mother was taken too fast, too soon. I saw fire. When we got home, I sat down at my desk and pulled up the FAA Lighting Compliance Index for hillside installations. Geraldine's uplights were registered to a fixture code that hadn't been active since 2009. That meant they weren't certified, and her permit, if it existed, was expired. She'd gone after a federally protected sculpture, and in doing so, she'd exposed the one thing she couldn't afford to have noticed: her own illegal lighting grid. I didn't need a warrant to check the public filings, just a laptop, a black coffee, and a quiet Sunday morning before Talus woke up. The FAA's obstruction evaluation portal was designed for transparency. Any structure that could interfere with air navigation, cell towers, light grids, helipads, had to be logged, reviewed, and approved through a publicly accessible system. I filtered by county, then narrowed it by coordinates. Clear Hollow Ridge popped up once. A landscaping permit from 12 years ago for decorative lampposts with under 3-meter clearance. The applicant, Geraldine Vossler, but that was the last entry. Her new lights? The uplight towers flanking her deck? Nothing. No update. No permit extensions. No change of use declarations. I pulled their elevation using LiDAR overlays from the county GIS system. 4.1 meters high, mounted at an angle, pointed straight into an active visual corridor for descending aircraft from the Ridgeway Municipal Airstrip. It wasn't just a violation, it was a hazard. I recorded every step: screen captures, geolocation data, time-stamped overlays. I knew how to package these things. I'd trained others to do it. But then I caught something I hadn't expected: a separate file buried in the HOA's own site under Community Enhancements Initiative. It was a scanned memo, unsigned, but bearing the board's seal. Lighting proposal for Bluffside Homes. Initial stage pre-approved pending architectural committee vote. Attached was a rough mock-up of a helipad, circular, reinforced base, with exact placement matching the deck I'd seen behind Geraldine's house. She wasn't building a luxury hangout spot. She was preparing private air access, and she was laundering the prep through the HOA budget, disguising it as shared infrastructure while burying the actual costs under landscaping line items. That explained the sudden uptick in fees. The beautification increases, the surge in enforcement against non-conforming homes. She needed money, and she needed everyone else to look the other way. I stepped outside just as the wind picked up. Talus's sculpture spun in perfect rhythm, its blades slicing through the morning light, casting moving shadows across the porch. I walked around to the side of the house where her light grid sensors were embedded, part of her original design. Low power, adaptive, ambient, reflective, harmless to the eye. And because they pulsed, they were federally tagged in the ADA inclusion database for sensory mapping zones. That was the technical term. But what it really meant was that Geraldine's unauthorized lights weren't just unregistered. They were directly adjacent to a protected therapeutic structure that had predated her installation. Legally, her lights were the intruders. Tallis wandered out mid-spin, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You're up early," she said. "I'm working," I replied, nodding to the tablet in my hand. She sat on the top step and watched her sculpture rotate for a moment. "It's been spinning differently," she said. "The air's been hitting from a different angle." That caught my attention. "You sure?" She nodded. "I adjusted the pitch last week, but now it tilts off center. I think something's reflecting heat near it." I blinked. Reflecting heat. My pulse ticked up. Uplights. If Geraldine's fixtures had high-wattage halogen elements, and not modern LED, they'd emit enough heat at night to disrupt nearby airflow. Even subtle changes could throw off Tallis's kinetic balance. And if that airflow disrupted the sculpture's response time, it wasn't just performance, it was sensory regulation. Her sculpture was a biofeedback loop. It was calibrated to her breath, her movements, her space. If those lights were affecting it, Geraldine hadn't just violated zoning, she had interfered with a medical device, and that moved this conflict into a different jurisdiction entirely. I reached for my phone, not to call a lawyer, to call someone I'd worked with years ago, an ADA consultant who specialized in therapeutic design conflicts. She'd helped write one of the clauses in the 7 and 12b9 inclusion code, the same code etched on the brass plaque Geraldine pretended not to see. I sent her the footage, the light elevation files, and the sculpture's calibration report Tallis had drafted for her science fair submission. Within 10 minutes, she replied with a single line, "You've got a case. A strong one." And just like that, Geraldine's fortress began to shake. Not from force, from fact. I placed the pad beside her pillow and walked back out to the porch. The sculpture was still spinning under the faint wash of Geraldine's uplights in the distance. But now, I knew exactly how to dim those beams. Geraldine had drawn her power from silence, but Orban had broken it, and I wasn't done yet. The rain hit before dawn, soft at first, then steady, like the neighborhood was being rinsed of something it didn't deserve to carry anymore. I was already at my desk when it started, finalizing the structure of my complaint to the FAA Zoning Review Board. Unlike the ADA filing, this one wasn't about emotion. It was about thresholds, heights, angles, light scatter, and Geraldine had violated every one. I laid it out clearly. Exhibit A, elevation mapping of the uplight towers. Exhibit B, lack of filing in the FAA's Form 74601 system for structures near navigable airspace. Exhibit C, confirmed proximity to a protected therapeutic device with registered federal ADA coding. Each claim was backed by data, time-stamped images, and comparison maps pulled from the county's GIS overlays. At the end, I added the altered HOA meeting minutes, redacted to protect Orban, but highlighted to show conflicting votes, skipped quorum procedures, and fake approvals of exterior structures. The zoning board didn't care about neighbor drama, but they cared deeply about unauthorized vertical fixtures that might distract pilots on approach to Ridgeway Municipal. They especially cared when those lights could trigger a Class 3 hazard flag in the descent corridor. I uploaded the packet, encrypted it, and sent it under formal whistleblower classification. Then I did the one thing Geraldine would never expect. I printed a second copy. Mid-morning, I walked to the HOA drop box at the front of the clubhouse and slid the envelope in, marked with my name, return address, and one sentence handwritten across the top. Submitted to FAA at 9:13 a.m. today. This is your courtesy copy. Let her sweat. By noon, I was back on my porch, watching the wind pick up again, the sculpture spinning with a rhythm it hadn't found in days. The rain had cleared the air, and the movement was smoother, lighter. Tallis stood at the edge of the porch, hair pulled back, holding a wrench in one hand and a new blade module in the other. She added a third light, she said flatly. I measured the heat radius. It's leaking into the kinetic arc. You measured it? She nodded. I used my phone's sensor logs. 3 nights ago, the sculpture was rotating 9 degrees too far west. Now it's 7 degrees east. She's not subtle, I muttered. She's trying to break it, Tallis said. But that just means it's working. I stared at her for a second, the way her eyes stayed steady, unflinching now. She wasn't hiding from this anymore. She was tracking it, countering it, building with resistance. I walked back inside and started mapping what would come next. Because if the FAA investigation landed, and it would, Geraldine would pivot. She'd say it was a misunderstanding, that the uplights were decorative, that permits had been filed, but there was an administrative delay. So I had to go deeper. The helipad deck. That was the endgame. And I needed hard proof it was built for landing, not leisure. I accessed the local drone registry. Pilots in our area had to log airspace use within 500 feet of residential flight corridors. Most kept open data. Sure enough, 2 separate entries from last week noted abnormal lighting observed at elevation approx. 13.4 FT, origin unclear, potential reflection hazard. Both came from independent flyers running night mapping projects. I reached out to one of them, a freelance topographer named Isa Ramos. I didn't tell her the details, just asked if she could pull her archived footage from the night in question and confirm the coordinates. 3 hours later, I had it. High-res thermal stills showing the outline of Geraldine's deck, the heat profile of the uplights, and the metallic glint of what looked unmistakably like landing struts. It wasn't a patio, it was a platform. I dropped the files into a secondary folder, labeled everything, and included ISA's data source permissions. That folder would go next, to the county permitting office, and from there, to the Ridgeway Zoning Integrity Bureau. I'd seen helipads built without approval before. Most were taken down within weeks. Fines were brutal. Insurance pulled coverage, and the board members who enabled it often faced civil liability. Geraldine didn't just overreach. She gambled everything on no one knowing what she was really doing. But I knew. And now I had the flight path. By nightfall, I stood in the backyard and looked out across the ridge toward her lot. There was no movement, but the deck was lit. It looked steady, unshaken, but so did the sculpture. And one of them was about to fall. The morning Geraldine's grip started to slip, she hosted a beautification walk. It was a signature move, dressed in authority, staged like outreach. She gathered 10 or so residents, handed out printed community standard checklists, and strolled the neighborhood like a monarch conducting inspection. I watched from the porch as they approached, her heels clicking confidently on the concrete, her voice exaggerated for the audience. We want to ensure harmony in every visible corner. Non-compliant elements can confuse new buyers. Behind her, 3 residents scribbled dutifully. The others glanced around like they weren't sure what they'd signed up for. When they reached my property line, she paused. "This," she said, gesturing toward Talus's sculpture with a dramatic turn, "remains in violation. Despite multiple notices, no corrective action has been taken, and now we're in formal lien territory." A few of the residents shifted. One of them, Glenn, from 2 doors down, cleared his throat. "Didn't you say it had federal approval?" Geraldine smiled thinly. "That's a common misunderstanding. No external structure is exempt from HOA design protocol unless we've reviewed and logged it." "Even if it's medical?" he asked. She blinked. "Just once." "Medical? That's a stretch." Talus stepped outside then. She didn't speak. She didn't wave. She simply walked past us all, adjusted one of the support anchors with a small wrench, and turned a dial on the sculpture's rear hub. It responded immediately, spinning smoother, tighter. Then she went back inside. No eye contact, no apology, just motion, the kind that unnerves people who rely on control. Geraldine tried to recover. Of course, personal expression is important, but our guidelines exist for a reason. That's when Orban appeared. He didn't speak either. Just joined the group, slightly behind, holding a folder in one hand. Her face went pale for a moment. Just for a second. She wasn't expecting him, and she definitely wasn't expecting him to hand that folder to me. I took it without a word, opened it, and held up one page. It was the financial breakdown for the Ridge West landscaping project, signed by Geraldine, with itemized charges for elevated platform foundation prep, ground-reinforced fixture installs, and angle-calibrated light grid installations, all buried under beautification. A quiet gasp slipped from someone in the group. "You're building something back there?" Glenn asked, eyes narrowing. Geraldine's smile froze. "It's just a deck," she said, "for personal use. I followed all procedures." "You filed a variance without quorum," Orban said. "You claimed we voted on it. We didn't." Another resident, Jolene from across the street, stepped forward. "Wait, is that why our fees went up this quarter? I thought we were replanting the south slope." Geraldine took a step back. "Let's not turn this into a spectacle." But it already was, because I'd timed everything down to the hour. At that exact moment, a city-marked sedan pulled into the cul-de-sac and parked along the curb. Out stepped an agent from the Ridgeway Zoning Integrity Bureau, clipboard in hand, vest zipped to the chin. He didn't look at me. Didn't have to. He walked straight past the group, straight toward Geraldine's property line, and began snapping photos of the uplight towers. One of the residents mumbled, "That's not good." Geraldine's face tightened. "This is harassment." The agent didn't respond. Just continued documenting. And then came the drone. Not hers. A city-issued quad, silent and fast, rising over the ridge and hovering over her backyard deck. It rotated, pulsed blue once, then returned to the vehicle. "Who called this in?" she snapped, spinning to me. "Would it matter?" I said. "I'll have your sculpture removed by force," she hissed. "Mark my words." I stepped off the porch, folder still in hand. "Go ahead," I said. "But when you do, you'll be in direct violation of federal ADA protection codes. And interfering with a registered therapeutic fixture during active investigation is a federal offense." Someone in the group muttered, "Therapeutic?" "It's registered," I said. "Under grant code 712B9. You signed the violation notice without even looking at the plate." Jolene's eyes widened. "That's the number stamped into the base?" Geraldine said nothing, because she knew she'd stepped into something far beyond HOA protocol, and the deck behind her house, lit and gleaming, was about to become evidence. The next 48 hours moved like the beginning of a collapse, slow at first, then all at once. By morning, the Ridgeway Zoning Integrity Bureau had posted a bright orange notice on the community board near the entrance gate. "Preliminary site evaluation in progress. Unauthorized vertical structures under review." It didn't name Geraldine, but it didn't have to. Her deck sat alone on the bluff. Everyone knew who it was aimed at. A second notice followed the same afternoon. This one slid under our front door. "Pending ADA inquiry. Protected therapeutic structure temporarily shielded from board enforcement." It was over. She just didn't know it yet. That evening, Tallis and I walked the ridge path. The sky split with low clouds and a trace of golden light bleeding across the rooftops. The sculpture had been spinning more freely since the temperature dip, each blade in sync, the weighted center holding balance through the gusts. Tallis didn't say much, but she watched it like she was listening to something only she could hear. Halfway down the trail, we passed Geraldine's property. Her lights were off now. The deck looked unfinished in daylight, raw support beams exposed, platform edges uneven. A temporary fence had gone up around it. Bright yellow plastic chain and a laminated county tag zip-tied to the post. Access restricted. Zoning violation inquiry. Jogger 4937A. The sight of it made my chest tighten, not out of satisfaction, but from something colder. The kind of weight that comes from finally seeing what power looks like when it begins to lose its shape. Tallis stopped walking. "Is it going to come down?" she asked. I nodded. "It will." She looked at the sculpture, then back at the deck. "It never balanced," she said softly. "Too wide in one direction. No counterweight." I wanted to say she was wrong, but she wasn't. Geraldine built it with the assumption no one would challenge it, just like everything else. When we got home, I found an email waiting in my inbox from the FAA zoning office. Not automated, not a generic receipt. It was a direct message from an agent I'd worked with a few years back in Denver. "Review initiated, inspection team notified. Thank you for thorough documentation. We'll coordinate findings with state accessibility authorities and municipal zoning to prevent duplication." That was the final gear turning. Whatever came next would be process-driven, recorded, unavoidable. I poured a cup of tea and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled cleaner after the day's drizzle, lighter somehow. I sat on the top step and watched the sculpture move. That's when the second message came in. A text. Unknown number. "I warned you not to push." No name, but I knew. I let the phone screen dim and locked it without replying. Let her squirm in the silence. Across the street, porch lights flicked on one by one. I saw Glenn and his wife walk out to water their potted palms. Jolene was seated on her balcony, reading under a yellow lamp. One by one, the residents of Clear Hollow Ridge began moving like they hadn't in weeks, like they were watching something crumble that had once kept them afraid. The next day, I spotted Orban at the mail kiosk. He didn't speak as I walked up beside him. just handed me a folded slip of paper. Board meeting was advanced to tomorrow, he said. Emergency session. She wants to contest the investigation. Try to reframe it as harassment. She can try, I said. She will. He paused. I'll back you, he added. Whatever you need. I don't care what she threatens anymore. I nodded. You already did more than enough. No, he said, turning to face me. Now I want to finish it. We stood there in the stillness, envelopes in hand, side by side under the wide shadow of the trees lining the boulevard. She made a lot of people small, Orban said quietly, but not you, not her. He meant Tallis. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. That night, I reviewed every file one last time. FAA data, ADA certification, lighting conflicts, altered minutes, illegally shifted funds, witness confirmations, anonymous drone footage, all stacked, all ready. I didn't know exactly how the next day would unfold, but I knew this. We weren't the ones on trial anymore. The emergency board meeting wasn't held in the clubhouse this time. Geraldine moved it to the community garden pavilion, a calculated choice. Open air, sunlight, cameras harder to hide. She wanted control back, wanted the optics of unity, of calm. But the sky didn't play along. Gray clouds sat low over Clear Hollow Ridge. No wind, no bird song, just a restless hush. I arrived early, not to speak first, but to be seen, calmly waiting, folders tucked under my arm, no fear in my step. By the time the meeting began, more than 50 residents had gathered, double the usual count. Some sat in lawn chairs, others stood behind the wooden benches. I caught Orban's eye from the second row. He gave a slight nod. Geraldine stood at the front of the pavilion, hands clasped over a binder. Her smile was brittle. Thank you all for coming, she began. I know there's been confusion. Confusion. That was the word she chose. As your elected HOA president, I want to reassure you that every action taken regarding community beautification, code compliance, and structural enhancements has been fully within the authority granted by our bylaws. There it was. The pivot. She flipped open her binder and began listing expenditures, replanting initiatives, light fixture upgrades, pathway platform construction for trail enhancement. Not once did she use the words deck or helipad. She was scrubbing the language clean mid-sentence. But too many people had already seen the scaffolding, the uplights, the platform that sat higher than any trail overlook had ever gone. I understand there's been concern about procedural clarity, she said. To that end, we will not entertain speculative accusations or rumors that could damage the board's integrity. She didn't mention me, not by name, but when her eyes landed on me, she held the stare for a fraction too long. That was my cue. I stood. I'd like to request the floor, I said. A few heads turned. Some phones came up. Geraldine hesitated. This isn't a forum for... Orban stood next. As acting treasurer, I second the request. She couldn't block it now, not without showing her hand. 2 minutes, she snapped. Then we move on. I walked to the front, laid my folder on the table, and opened it without fanfare. This, I said, is a confirmed ADA registration for the kinetic sculpture on my property, filed under code 712B9. It's not a decoration. It's a therapeutic structure protected under federal law. Several murmurs from the crowd. I turned a page. This is a report from the Ridgeway Zoning Integrity Bureau confirming unpermitted lighting installations that violate FAA glare restrictions. The source? Ms. Vossler's backyard. Another page. And this, I tapped the document, is a ledger showing HOA funds redirected to a private vendor without competitive bid, used to build a structure not approved in any community meeting. A structure now fenced off and flagged for zoning violation. Geraldine stepped forward. You're misrepresenting... I'm quoting public records, I said. You can challenge them, but not with words, only with proof. I looked to the crowd. I moved here with my daughter to rebuild. We followed every rule, filed every design. When Geraldine couldn't control what we built, she tried to erase it, and in doing so, exposed what she never wanted seen. Silence. Thick. Heavy. Then Glenn stood up. I vote to suspend her pending investigation. Jolene followed. Seconded. Geraldine's face blanched. You don't have that authority. Yes, we do, Orban said, stepping forward. Under Section 4.8 of the Emergency Oversight Clause. She froze, because it was real, and she hadn't expected him to know it. A third voice called out, I vote yes, then another, and another. Hands went up, not all, but enough. Orban turned to her. You're suspended from all board activity, effective immediately, pending review. She stared at him, then at me, then back at the crowd, like she couldn't decide whether to scream or flee. Instead, she said nothing, just closed her binder and walked down the center aisle, each step slower than the last. No one moved aside. She had to weave through them, and still, no one looked away. I stood there in the silence that followed, not triumphant, just steady. We hadn't just exposed her, we'd reclaimed the space she'd ruled by fear, and the wind, at last, had returned. The platform came down 2 weeks later, not all at once. No sirens, no headlines, just a quiet, methodical dismantling by a contracted crew sent by the Ridgeway Zoning Integrity Bureau. They removed the lights first, unbolting the towers Geraldine once called decorative ambiance, while the neighbors watched from behind porch rails and kitchen windows. Then the beams went, then the joists, then the platform itself, hauled away in rust-stained truck beds like it had never belonged here. Tallis and I stood on our own porch that morning, coffee in my hand, sketchbook in hers. She didn't smile, but I caught the way her fingers relaxed across the paper like something had finally let go. Her sculpture spun smooth and strong beside us, blades whispering through the wind like a language only she understood. Geraldine hadn't returned to any board meetings since her suspension. Technically, she hadn't even tried. Orban took over interim duties. He began posting transparent updates on the community app, real budgets, open votes, a poll about planting native shrubs instead of imported topiary. Someone had power washed the community signage and replaced the brittle bulbs in the clubhouse with soft glow LEDs. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. And for the first time since we moved here, Clear Hollow Ridge felt like a place people actually lived, not just endured. That afternoon, Tallis finished her redesign for the sculpture. Not because the first one failed, but because she'd evolved. She added mirrored panels that would reflect seasonal light shifts and mounted a second sensor on the west side to track wind drag after sundown. She even built a companion sculpture in miniature, small enough to carry, a model she donated to the local therapy center 2 towns over. When they called to thank her, she didn't say much, just nodded and wrote their name in the corner of a new schematic. I framed that one. The investigation into Geraldine's misuse of funds continued, now in the hands of the county's Civil Oversight Committee. Whether or not she'd face charges wasn't in my hands, and that was fine. What mattered was this. The board would never again operate without scrutiny. The residents had seen what silence enabled, and they were done playing polite. Glenn started a neighborhood walking group. Jolene began a newsletter with updates on zoning issues, mental health resources, and monthly creative spotlights. In the first edition, Tallis's sculpture took the top corner. The caption read, "Art that fought back." I never asked for any of it, but I didn't refuse it either, because for the first time in a long time, something broken had been made whole again, not by yelling, not by threats, but by standing, quietly and steadily, until the wrong thing gave out. And that, more than any form or code, was the lesson I hoped Tallis carried with her, that people can wield rules like weapons. But truth, when measured and presented without flinching, will cut cleaner. We didn't move, we didn't bend, and we didn't let them decide what healing should look like. So if you've got a story like ours, if your HOA crossed a line, if they tried to erase what made your home feel like home, don't just take it. Document everything. Learn their language. Speak it better than they do. And when the time comes, speak it out loud. Because you never know who's watching from their own porch, quietly hoping someone else will go first. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where in the country you're watching from. Because trust me, someone out there needs to hear it. That night, Tallis didn't eat much. She moved her food around with her fork, eyes unfocused, the same way she used to before her mother passed. The silence at the table pressed against my chest like a second weight. When I asked her what was wrong, she didn't answer right away. Then she whispered, "It's happening again." I didn't need her to explain. I knew what she meant. After Lena died, Tallis had folded inward. No outbursts, no tantrums, just a slow and quiet withdrawal. Her voice had slipped beneath the surface, and for months, I could only reach her through shapes and motion. That sculpture was the first thing that brought her back. The moment it spun, she started humming again. Short, slow rhythms at first, matching its cadence. Now she was afraid it was being taken from her, not by grief this time, but by someone who thought compliance mattered more than healing. That's when I committed fully. No second guessing, no more observing from the sidelines. I wasn't going to let that woman erase my daughter's voice. I returned to my office and opened every file. Geraldine's uplight placements, her false budget reallocations, the illegal elevation of the deck, the absence of permits, the altered HOA minutes. Then I added the most important document, the ADA certification report my old contact had emailed me. A full breakdown of how Talas's sculpture was functioning as a medically recognized sensory regulation structure under federal code. Verified, stamped, legally protected. It was no longer about style, it was health. Every piece of evidence I needed was now cataloged. Still, evidence wasn't strategy. Not yet. So I mapped out the connections. Geraldine's uplights were affecting air currents and thermal flow, which in turn compromised a protected structure. That created a direct ADA conflict. Her false pre-approvals and backdated board votes created an administrative misconduct case. The lack of permits tied it to zoning violations. The visual corridor breach flagged it for FAA interest. Each thread led to a different agency. If I tried to pull them all at once, I'd dilute the focus. But if I started with the one that mattered most, the ADA violation, I could trigger a forced inspection. And once a state inspector stepped foot in Clear Hollow Ridge, the rest of her violations would come to light on their own. Talas's sculpture wasn't just a target anymore. It was the opening move. The next day, I called the State Department of Disability Access and Support. I kept it simple. An anonymous tip regarding ADA-protected therapeutic equipment being compromised by unregulated heat and light sources in a residential community. I provided the registration number, the impact report, and the calibration shifts. I included the thermal map I'd built using drone shadow patterns and peak light output. Within hours, I had a response. The case was assigned for review. They'd be contacting the community board for official documentation. Geraldine wouldn't be able to fabricate that, not without a certified ADA consultant on file, and Clear Hollow Ridge didn't have one. I didn't tell Talas right away, not because I didn't trust her, but because I wanted her to have one more quiet moment without pressure. I wanted her to keep building. That evening, I found her outside, adjusting the pitch of the sculpture's blades again. I recalibrated it, she said softly, compensating for lateral drift. Her words were confident, grounded. I stood beside her, watching the movement. It spun more evenly now, but still carried the tension of something resisting the current. "Why don't you stop?" I asked. "Just leave it as it is." She didn't even pause, because then it wouldn't adapt. It would just stand still. And that was it. That was why I couldn't stop either, because the moment we let things stand still in the face of people like Geraldine, people who steamroll through nuance and healing just to keep power, we let them decide the rules of motion, of worth, and we stop adapting, we start disappearing. I wasn't going to let that happen to her again. By morning, I'd blocked out 3 hours to finalize my submission package for the FAA zoning board. I already had the name of the regional compliance officer. I'd trained him 5 years ago. This wasn't personal for him, but for me, it was all personal now. Orban showed up at my door just after dusk, holding a folder clutched tight to his chest, like it might vanish if he loosened his grip. He didn't ring the bell, just stood there under the porch light, eyes scanning the street like he didn't want to be seen. I opened the door without a word. He stepped inside like he was sneaking into enemy territory. "I only have a few minutes," he said, voice low, breath tight. He laid the folder on the kitchen table and opened it. Inside were copies of board meeting minutes, 2 versions of each, one handwritten, one typed. The signatures didn't match. The dates were off by a week. The phrasing and the final motions had been altered. The vote counts had been changed to unanimous. "She told me they were just formatting updates," he said, "that she was consolidating notes. Said it didn't matter as long as the intent was clear." "But you didn't vote to approve the uplights?" I asked. His mouth twisted. "I voted to discuss them, that's all." One of the notes was scribbled on a napkin. "Geraldine to file permits after final placement, pending budget vote." But the typed version claimed permits had already been secured. "This was for the lights?" I asked. He nodded. "And the deck." I flipped to the next page. A breakdown of HOA funds allocated for community slope beautification. The amount? $18,600. The vendor listed, Ridgewest Landscaping, LLC. I looked it up on my phone, registered to someone named Derek Vossler. "Her nephew," Orban said, already anticipating my question. No competitive bids, no disclosure. She's funneling it, I said, and hiding it behind enforcement campaigns. Orban's hands tightened on the edge of the table. I didn't know until it was too late, and when I tried to ask questions, things changed. How? My mailbox was vandalized. My gate stopped opening on the community access schedule. I started getting violation notices for things that had been approved years ago. My wife wanted to move. He looked at me then, finally meeting my eyes fully for the first time. But you stayed, I said. Because I watched your daughter, he said quietly, the way she built that sculpture, the way she comes out every morning to check the balance. I knew what Geraldine was doing to you was worse, and I couldn't unsee it. The weight of that sat between us for a long second. I can't speak publicly, he said. Not yet, but you can use these. I nodded. I don't need you on camera. I just need your word. You have it. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. She's scared, he added. That sculpture, it's not just non-compliant to her. It's unpredictable. She doesn't know how to control it. Or you. He stepped into the night and disappeared down the sidewalk before anyone could see. I stared down at the folder. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. That night, I scanned every page, time-stamped them, and submitted a package to the State Compliance Board under anonymous whistleblower protections. The altered minutes, the financial discrepancies, the vendor ties, combined, they painted a picture of procedural fraud. But more importantly, they created a crack wide enough for a formal investigation to begin. By the time I shut down my computer, the house was dark and still. I walked to Talis's room. Her door was open. She was asleep on top of her blanket, sketch pad still in her lap. I lifted it gently and looked at the drawing. It was the sculpture, but not the current version. This one had extended arms, mirrored panels, and a new set of anchor points, counterweights that could shift mid-spin. She'd drawn it as if it were floating, orbiting a central axis. In the corner, she'd written a word I hadn't seen her use in months. Stability. That was her goal. That was what she was fighting for. Not attention, not defiance, balance.